Good morning, good afternoon to everybody, depending on where you are across North America. Welcome. My name is Terry Adamson. I'm the Technical Director with Fenestration Canada. Welcome to our first 2025 Tech Talks. We're always looking for topics and suggestions for Tech Talk sessions, so feel free to shoot me your ideas at terry@fenestrationcanada.ca. I'd also like to thank our Tech Talk sponsor, OpenJanela Software. Really appreciate their support. So today's session is Understanding U.S. Tariffs and Proposed Trade Policies. Presenting today is Adrian Edge, Fenestration Canada's Director of Codes and Regulatory Affairs. And with him, we are really pleased to have Michael Pierce. He's WDMA's Director of Government Affairs. So welcome to you both. We'll hold the questions to the end, and we can do that through either the chat or the raise hand feature. So Adrian, let's go.
All right, let's do this. Well, big thanks to everyone for joining us for this one. It admittedly took a fair bit to kind of unpack this topic, and especially because the topic is still evolving, it's kind of tricky. So yeah, everyone bear with me while we get as much information back to you on kind of the general topic and where things are. But before we get started, Michael, I wanted to give you a floor for a second to just kind of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit on where you sit in the world.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm really happy to sit here with your members and some of ours who I'm sure are on the line here today. I recently took over the government affairs portfolio over at WDMA in the United States, and I've been leading our charge on policy and some regulatory issues. And one of the big ones that we've been dealing with is tariffs. I know you guys are as well. So I'm excited to try and hopefully shed light and answer as many questions as we can. It's a bit opaque at the moment, but I think we're starting to get a little bit more clarity on these issues. But that's sort of a brief rundown of who I am and where we're at.
Awesome. Well, yeah, yeah, let's just go ahead and jump right in. So this is what today's conversation is going to look like. First, we're going to give you a story to help illustrate how tariffs work and what a trade war looks like. Um, then we're going to lean into how US tariffs are implemented, talk a little bit about what we know today for both the US and Canadian sides on the potential impacts for the Canadian window and door manufacturers. And before we get started, Michael, I'm not going to speak for you, but I am no economist, but I have done my best to lean into this subject as deeply as I could, to give you guys kind of an honest conversation from our end on how, as an association or as associations, we view this and what we can do to just kind of prepare ourselves for, yeah, I hate to say worst case scenario, because we probably don't know what that actually looks like, but we'll get into more of that as we go into the conversation. And for many of you that joined with our commercial chapter, I really appreciate you being here. And a lot of this is going to be a bit of a repeat, considering that the background is kind of the same. But all the same, thank you very much for coming round two. So let's get started with a presentation on a tariff war in the past. So let me introduce you to the chicken war. So in the late 1950s, early 1960s, U.S. farmers had developed a highly efficient method of producing poultry, dramatically lowering the cost. Europe was still rebuilding after the war, and their agricultural sectors were still redeveloping and less efficient. At the time, the Americans could produce chickens at roughly 30 to 50% lower than the cost that European farmers could produce. By 1961, the US exports of frozen chicken to Europe had risen by about 60,000 metric tons annually, valued at what today would be $450 million. The flood of cheap American chicken drove prices down in Europe by about 50%. So this was particularly hard on West Germany and France. The European Economic Community, or the ECC, who was the precursor to the European Union, started getting concerned that the rural livelihood and national food security of their member countries were threatened by the issue. So the EEC, or the Economic Community, started imposing tariffs and quotas on frozen chickens in response. The EEC put into place what is called an ad valorem tariff on frozen chicken parts and whole frozen chickens by charging a percent of the total cost of goods. As chicken parts or the whole chicken came into the EEC countries, the chickens were taxed at 20% before arriving to consumers, and that tax revenue was kept by the EEC. Tariffs can either be a percent of total cost, a fixed cost, or a combination of the two. Functions like a quota can also be used to manage trade. So there's a whole bunch of levers that the government has outside of tariffs, but for our purposes, obviously, we're leaning into that portion of the conversation. The effect was immediate on West Germany, and they saw a decline of imports as much as 75%. Meaning that the amount of frozen chickens coming into the market, or the U.S. market, the U.S. coming into Germany, decreased by about 75%. Over the whole of Europe, chicken farms in the U.S. saw a drop about 35% in 3 years. In 1963, the U.S. retaliated with their own tariff on light trucks, cognac, potato starch, and dextrin. Of those, the light trucks, or what was called the chicken tax, was the most significant. Light trucks were tariffed at about 25%, making those vehicles exported to the US cost prohibitive, causing a steep 50% or more drop in US sales of European light trucks like the Volkswagen microbus, which in the 1960s would have been iconic, and then you kind of see it just fall away. Although the trade war was settled down by the early 1960s, the tariffs on chickens and light trucks still persist to this day for both the EU and in Canada, or in the US. As an overall outcome of this trade war, the EU ultimately lost more than it gained. They protected their chicken market, but lost billions in potential overall revenue in the US light truck market and the jobs that would have accompanied that production. For the US, the move to protect the light truck market was ultimately an economic win, but potentially a relationship loss. Almost every decade since, the EU and the US has had a new trade war. One of my favorites of those is in the 1990s, they had what they called the banana wars, which was almost as ridiculous as the chicken wars, in my opinion. Um, in the grand scheme of trade wars, the chicken wars outcome is actually better than most, given that Europe got to keep its chicken production stable and the US grew its light truck market without external pressures. So there was actually economic gain, loss and gain for both. But really, this wasn't that bad of an outcome. The majority of trade wars involving retaliatory tariffs result in reduced trade volume, increased cost to consumers and businesses, and market uncertainty. Overall, GDP, revenue loss, and job loss are common outcomes with trade wars, where almost almost universally you can kind of expect there to be a no-win situation between both countries. So hopefully with that example, I've detailed what a tariff and a trade war looks like. So I'd like to bring us a bit closer to the conversation at hand by taking a look at the history of Canadian and US trade. So from the, call it mid 1800s, really post War of 1812 till the Great Depression, US and Canadian trade relationships were pretty strained. But we really struggled with each other, which, no surprise. You have a war with your neighbor and, it's a lot of yelling over a fence. So in the 1930s, the US passes what's called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which puts tariffs on 20,000 imported goods to historically high levels to combat the issue of overproduction in the US in their agriculture sector and failing in falling prices. In retaliation, Canada and various other countries responded by imposing their own tariffs on American goods, causing global trade volume to fall by 65%. This is one of the primary reasons for the widespread unemployment and reduced industrial output at the time. The act had such a negative impact that after World War II, the international community, including the US and Canada, worked towards creating institutions like the General Agreement on Tariffs, and later the World Trade Organization, which worked to mitigate and decrease overall tariffs globally. For Canada and the US, up until 2018, when US and Canada found itself in a trade war over steel and aluminum. So we've been good from about 1930 to 2018. There has been very little in the way of, call it, tariffs, retaliatory tariffs. There was a soft lumber tariff that came in a little earlier that has been a bit of a contention, but ultimately, we've been acting as good trade partners for a long time. So similar to light truck tariff, the tariffs passed in 2018 are not only still in place, but over the course of the previous administration, those tariffs actually were made more punitive and continue to make negative impacts on both countries. So one of the key takeaways I really want to give, based off of the chicken war and the 2018 aluminum tariff, is that if tariffs are put into place, it's very unlikely that the government is going to let go of those tariffs. It becomes really a political tool. So now we're going to lean into the present. For anyone that is interested in unpacking the various threats that Donald Trump has been making regarding annexation or any other threats that are involved in, call it, positive trade outcomes for the US, at this point, there's a lot of information out on YouTube, and I am happy to point you in that direction. But I'm going to keep us focused on the threat of the US applying a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods. So first, let's take a look at how this is legally done and who's involved. So there are three methods that the US can use to implement a tariff, and they have various requirements and timelines. What I should do is I should just let you know up front that the first two that we're going to go through are not the path at this point, and I think we have pretty clear view that that's not likely what's going to happen. So I'm kind of breaking this up front. But you have two versions of tariffs. You have a Section 232 tariff, which is executed on the purposes of national security. These are often used to protect industries that are deemed critical for national security. There is a Section 301 tariff, which is about unfair trade practices, which really deals with broader trade disputes, particularly those involving intellectual property and market access issues. They don't require the same level of national security justification and makes it pretty versatile. So I've really provided the parties underneath both of these tariffs because I think this was the intent, was that when these Section 232 tariffs or the Section 301 tariffs were put into place, they had a fair bit of checks and balances kind of baked into the process. So what we wound up with later on, or is like 1979, you have the International Emergencies Economic Powers Act, which essentially says if the president declares a national emergency, then the president, ideally with congressional oversight and judicial review, can implement tariffs without any additional process involved. Michael, before we move on from this slide, do you want to give any more on how U.S. tariffs are put into place or anything, that you would like to add to that portion of the conversation?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. There's also the potential for legislative tariffs that can be levied, and that's something that we can talk about a little bit later about what that might look like going forward.
Sounds good. Yeah, so I mentioned at the beginning of this that I am fairly certain that we are looking at a International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The reason for that assumption right now is that with uh, President Trump's inauguration, he enacted two national emergencies, which allow him to lean into the IEPA and use national emergencies as a justification for enacting the EPA. Is that kind of how you see it, Michael?
That's how I see it for under the U.S. Mexico Canada situation. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got a slide right now that I'm going to just talk about implementing a Section 301 tariff, which, in my humble opinion, if Trump was to enact the tariffs in a way that aligns with the intent of how tariffs were written in the US, this would be the direction that he'd be taking. Obviously, with the IEPA, he doesn't really have to do that. But all the same, I think it's useful to kind of see what that process looks like in its intent. So once Trump is inaugurated, let's assume he, yesterday decided we're going to go ahead and put this 25% tariff on Canada, and then we're following what would be essentially the average amount of time for implementing this. So once the investigation has been started, there's 12 months that are dedicated to the call it investigation period. Which the Office of the United States Trade Representative, or the USTR, would determine whether or not Canada's trade practices are harmful and decide on what actions would be appropriate. As a note, the USTR is appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So I don't see that this would have been difficult for Trump to get what he needed out of that. Um, After the investigation and the USTR has given their recommendation, a public comment period is open to allow stakeholders to provide feedback. After that public feedback period, the USTR reviews and finalizes its recommendations to the president. The president then makes the final decision on tariffs or the measures published in the Federal Register. It's reasonable to assume that 12 to 18 months from the initiation of that investigation is when those tariffs would be put into place. So that brings us to the IEEPA. What does it look like for that to get implemented? First, Trump would have to declare a national emergency, as I mentioned. That's done. From there, a draft and implementation of the tariff measures would have to be created. Then the tariff would need to be published to the Federal Register, and this could take anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks. The risk Trump takes in going in this direction is potentially isolating himself from congressional support for other initiatives that will require their buy-in. And not everything is this easy to get through. And I think in the past I would have said that it may be a bit of a weight in his decision, but it doesn't look like it. I would say that based off of the comments over the last couple days, I don't think he's worried about that. So let's get into the reasoning behind the tariffs. So Trump's claim for the reasoning behind this threat is an issue with fentanyl and illegal immigration at the Canadian-Mexican borders, and a proposed subsidy to Canada in the form of a trade deficit. The border is something the premiers and call it the general Canadian government has taken, I think, seriously, and is working and has worked out a plan to address. They've outlined a 6-year plan that is a total of $900 million to deploy, which would include helicopters, drones, additional surveillance solutions, sniffer dogs. But the truth is nothing yet has been disclosed on the data or the metrics that they are going to use to prove that we are being effective with a new border plan. So this next claim of the U.S. subsidizing Canada, which I'll be honest, over the last week and a half, I haven't heard a whole lot more on that. Seems like border and migration is kind of the real focus of this. But this U.S. subsidizing Canada is kind of a hard thing to pin down because Trump has not been abundantly clear on what he means by this. So the general expectation has been that he's really talking about a trade imbalance or a trade deficit between countries, meaning that what the U.S. sells to Canada is less than what Canada sells to the U.S. So he oftentimes has claimed $100 billion as kind of his baseline comment, which is probably, again, which is why we're thinking it's a trade deficit. That what we have is a trade deficit in products is $78 billion or $40 billion when adjusted for services. So of that trade, 25% of it is crude oil that the US buys and upgrades and sells to other countries and powers their energy deficit, which is about 16 to 20% of the US's energy requirements. Michael, before we move on from this, do you want to add any more to what you've heard on your side or kind of the US perspective on what it is the US is looking at or looking for out of Canada?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things, and I think it really the real crux of what the Trump administration is looking for are around border and migration and drug concessions. That is primarily where his support base and from political support really comes from. A lot of this stuff is around those issues. The trade deficit is so a number that is put in front of him, and he gets annoyed. But fundamentally, this is very much when it comes to Trump, it's always a little bit of a guessing game based on who's spoken to him last and what is he's fixated on at any given moment. My understanding, though, from my conversations with folks around town here, is that border and migration is really the crux of his issue.
Yeah, and as we've heard back from different premiers and yeah, you like the Melanie Jolie, our trade minister, they agree that is really the focus of the Trump administration. We as Canadians, from like the discussion, that's what we need to be focused on in order for this to be. Um, don't know if it would make any changes, but it is something that we need to work through. Um, so. I Tariffs by nature are political tools, so the decision is ultimately going to be handled by those in power. So this conversation is a huge topic, obviously, between both countries. And I've gone ahead and taken three political or Canadian politicians that I think represents either the core sentiment that we're hearing out of Canada or are potentially uniquely challenged by these tariffs. For instance, Ontario or Doug Ford has said that they project to lose 500,000 jobs as a result of the US applying these 25% tariffs. Alberta is going to be in a really tough spot to deal with it, given that, crude oil is probably one of Canada's strongest weapons in a potential trade war. And for Alberta, that crude oil makes up about 25% of their total GDP out. It is by far the largest item on their plate. And without knowing what our Canadian elections are going to look like moving forward with Trudeau stepping down, it's not unreasonable to potentially see Poilievre having to handle the crisis, and his viewpoint is going to be very different than a liberal candidate. So here's a summary of kind of what these three have to say on the topic. So early on, Premier Smith has been a strong advocate for addressing Trump's concerns directly. As we've already kind of talked about, border is really going to be the rationale behind this push, and this is something that I think Canadians overall agree can be improved. It's something that we actually benefit from and improve on. Additionally, the premier has been clear that our collective clear that we need to be working through collective bargaining that doesn't target one province. Now, this is pretty controversial, but I think that it's one of those big topics in Canada right now is whether or not a coalition of the premiers is stronger, backing a retaliatory tariff kind of measure, or is Daniel Smith's we should negotiate and make that really our core. That's an ongoing debate. So Premier Smith has spent a lot of her time in Washington recently trying to progress that conversation and pull information back to Canada on what we could be doing. Premier Doug Ford, from his conversations with governors and senators in the US, essentially has collected that it's not universally supported by the US. This isn't something that like all the US is on board and they all agree to the same vision of what tariffs would look like moving forward. That being said, if tariffs do go through, he's been clear that Ontario is prepared to retaliate with steel, plastics, bourbon, orange juice, and this morning he threatened to cut off the electrical exports. So from Ontario's a big one because it makes up about half of our population, and so they have kind of this really strong weight to the conversation, and Doug Ford has been a very strong advocate of retaliatory tariffs. So Polyev really 2-3 weeks ago had given a handful of comments that really were in alignment with Canada needs to become energy independent. We need to work on figuring out how to process our own oil. And truly, he would have viewed that as a requirement earlier on than where we are now. Like having a tariff there to kind of start that journey is kind of unnecessary. But we should have been kind of down that path. He also sees that we need to be making investments into our infrastructure in such a way that makes us more attractive to not only the US, but to other countries. He, in last week's conversation, does support retaliatory tariffs, but is in favor of negotiation first. And I will say, since the inauguration, he's been very quiet. There's just not a lot coming from his camp. That's likely because there's a push in the background to call for a federal election, and I'm sure that's just weighed in kind of the balance of things. Michael, anything you want to say as far as that's a bit of is there, specifically on senators and call it the overall political establishment and their support of tariffs?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different dynamics at play. The Senate and the House, really what we're talking about here is the Republican side of the aisle. Democrats, they're going to be broadly against all of this on a lot of ideological grounds, you name it, but they're kind of irrelevant in this conversation. When it comes to tariffs and our elected leaders in the Republican Party in the House and Senate, there's broad support at the moment. The Senate less so. There's a lot more consternation around this, particularly around states that have a border with particularly Canada, but Mexico as well, where there is a lot of trade, and they don't want to see that. They don't want to see that economic driver in their states be diminished. So there is concern there, and they don't want to see these tariffs go through in the way that they're being talked about at the moment. But that remains to be seen. I think that's also part of the reason why we haven't seen anything on paper yet, as to what exactly tariffs will end up looking like, whether they're going to come from, 301, 232, or the IEPA area, IEPA, or if it's going to be a legislative. And I'm happy to, I'll get into what exactly a legislative issue may look like, but there is some serious talk in, committees of jurisdiction, that being the Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, about using tariffs to help pay for their reconciliation package around tax and immigration issues. So that's something to look out for, something we're tracking and keeping a very sharp eye on. But it is more popular than I think I'm comfortable with.
Huh.
Um,
That's really interesting insight, especially because I would say from the Canadian side of the media, it has been pretty universal that the Canadian politicians come back and they say, the U.S. is just not in support. But if looking at it from the U.S. lens, that's not entirely true. That
mhm.
it is, yeah, there's a bit of a conflict even in the narrative that is being kind of shared between the two, and so yeah, I appreciate that insight. All right, so next is going to be, the big glaring outcome of all of this. It is likely a recession for Canada, and more importantly, the threat that economists are warning about is stagflation, where our economy either grows very slowly or not at all. Unemployment increases substantially, and the cost of goods and services rise rapidly as companies try to recover from the various effects of the tariffs. Honestly, in Canada, this has been a background risk since COVID. Our economy has been kind of on this balancing act, but we've been fairly strong, surprisingly strong, I think, over the last couple of years, in spite of the fact that it is, yeah, it's unstable. Like that's been kind of the ongoing conversation. So what economists warn about is that Canadians are likely to see a decline in our total gross domestic products by 2.5% by early 2026. We are likely to have an inflation surge by about 7.2% by mid 2025, and are likely to see unemployment increase, or we should be looking at a loss of about 150,000 jobs by the end of 2025. And all of these numbers assume no retaliation from Canada. It's really, really hard to look at what those numbers would look like with Canada retaliating without knowing the industries they'd be targeting and how severe some of those tariffs would be. Um, Michael, do you have any numbers on your side as far as what the US public is expecting, or the US economy is expecting, as far as an outcome to the 25% tariffs?
Not at the moment. I have, some old data on what happened previously, but really it's difficult to tell without knowing exactly where and how these tariffs are going to be implemented. So there hasn't been a ton of forecasting at the moment.
Yeah, the little bit that I was reading, it put the or the U.S. consumer loss per year at somewhere between $300 and $500 per year, and that was mostly on groceries and then oil. It's really gas and groceries seem to be the most direct impact to U.S. consumers. For Canadian consumers, it was closer to like $700 per year, and the impact had to do with a whole variety of special goods and automobiles and a few other things. But that was kind of the balancing act that I was reading. So for manufacturers who sell into the US, windows and doors are going to be at a particular disadvantage in this change. Uh, Canadian manufacturers are going to be at a disadvantage. Our goods are what would be considered elastic, meaning that a US buyer can fairly easily switch to a domestic or alternative supplier. It's not unreasonable to expect that those that sell into the US could see a potential 40% or more reduction in export sales based off of the current data. Um, you know, I feel this really close to home, working for, having worked for a window and door manufacturer that's sold into the US. I can't fathom what this actually looks like, because if I had a whole suite of projects in the US, there's going to be questions now of whether or not my developers are going to keep the windows in the project, because a 25% increase on those goods or more on a project, it makes many of the US projects non-viable. We were already tweaking around with 5, 10% in order to get projects off the ground. And so this kind of impact for those US projects are brutal. So that's on projects that are secured now, but for projects moving forward, I don't think it's reasonable to expect most window and door manufacturers selling to the US are going to be at a competitive rate in such a way that it would be worth a project to take a good look at it. It's a pretty critical view, and there's a lot going on with window and doors in Canada with some of our energy changes, but I don't think it's unreasonable to think that it is going to be a fairly steep reduction in export sales. Um, so I've been trying to, at my best, keep the conversation away at guessing what Canada is going to do as far as retaliation. Um, but the truth is, Canada retaliating is inevitable if this moves forward. Currently, plastics and steel are both on the potential goods that the Canadian government has put forward as retaliation. Depending on what kind of tariff would be put into place, the effects on our industry could be a net loss of anywhere between $200 to $600 million in the fenestration industry. So the assumptions there are that we would see a rise of material costs by about 15 to 20%, where it represents 7.5 to 12% of total cost increase. Um, yeah, and is an interesting note, similar to the IEPA. We in Canada, if we do get smacked with a tariff, our retaliatory tariffs can be implemented fairly quickly. So within a few weeks to a month, we could see tariffs implemented as a retaliation. Um, Michael, do you have any thoughts on how the US window and door manufacturers could be affected by this?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of the same ways that Canadian manufacturers will. I think there will be, obviously, particularly on the component and supply side, there's going to be a large increase in costs that will result in projects getting delayed or canceled, and this is only going to serve to make, housing ultimately on, both sides of the border much more expensive, and slow down progress that we're making on some of these affordability crises. So there's on our side of the border, what we're hearing and very worried about is that increased cost. That's going to hurt the communities that we all operate in, and many of the small towns that have manufacturing facilities. We would see there being a dramatic slowdown, not to mention the inflationary problems that result from this, the increased price of eggs that likely will, that may come out of this. So, those are our broad concerns, and I believe they're shared with you guys.
So, yeah, I think this kind of gets us into the stumbling into assumptions category as we get into, you know, what's going to happen to the eggs, what's going to happen on our side when it comes to, an iPhone that we buy. Um, it, it is very much crystal ball type of conversation. So I'm just going to lean right into it and give some predictions on our side. Um, because of stagflation, I would see it likely because of, kind of historically how this has happened. The renovation market is likely to be a fairly healthy place, because you're going to have people that are holding on to their homes for longer. So, the building material market is likely to see growth. Um, Problem with that growth, though, is that if we have a stunted overall consumer buying problem, then there's just only so much money that is going to go around. Um, So in Canada and the US, though I'll let Michael speak more to that, the renovation market for us is the Wild West. There are code changes that are expected in Canada for the 2030 cycle for alterations to existing buildings that would add a bit more regulatory power behind that segment. But a market under pressure isn't necessarily going to play by the rules. So if we don't have rules for it, then yeah, Wild West is probably the best way for me to describe that. Um, as I kind of mentioned before, getting boxed out of the US market is gonna put a lot of Canadian manufacturers into a place that they're hungry, and the competition is going to be brutal. So that comes up against a problem that I have heard from our manufacturers quite a bit, which is the external competition factor, which I expect to get worse instead of getting better due to this. The price pressures due to oversupply and a market shrinking is inevitable. So I will say on our part, it's not a pretty picture. On the Canadian side, our industry is going to have to we're going to have to advocate for support to innovate and commercialize our products in such a way that allows us to be competitive outside of the US if we have any chance of seeing growth over the next 5 to 10 years. So Michael, if you were to pull out the US version of that crystal ball, what does that look like for your manufacturers?
I think broadly similar, but I think less extreme. We have it is a much larger market here. There's certainly we deal with when it comes to codes and standards, we've got 50 states all writing and producing their own based on their own state's needs. But what we're worried about is just the increased overhead that this creates and the increased prices and inflation. Particularly when we look at places like California, where there's going to need to be a significant and very quick amount of rebuilding that's going to happen in the next 5 years, with a lot of the fire damage that has devastated a huge chunk of LA. That alone is gonna be significant driver in prices. So I'm seeing what we're seeing and what we're worried about is getting components and those raw materials at competitive prices, which this will absolutely not help. And it's going to drive up prices across the board and result in just a fundamentally more expensive window and door and skylight. So we would expect to see some cooling in the marketplace just from that perspective alone.
Yeah, and that gets me to the problem with the whole conversation as far as I'm concerned, which is known unknowns. Like there are three that I think are critical to the conversation. The terms of the U.S. tariff I think are important. We're talking oftentimes about there being 25% on all goods sold to Canada. The problem we have by not having these things written in stone is that we're missing big portions of what the negotiation could look like. For instance, there could be critical imports such as crude oil that allow Trump to claim 25% on all goods while providing a quota on crude oil, allowing the U.S. to get what you all need as far as your basic energy requirements. Which if you had a quota, you essentially could say crude oil doesn't need to be charged this 25% tariff until I meet that quota and then enact that 25% tariff. And that can all be hidden kind of in the background of what the terms of that agreement look like. He has already threatened to embed counter retaliatory tariffs or expected retaliations to the tariffs. That there's a eye for an eye type of act that he threatened last week that would essentially say for every retaliatory tariff to the tariffs put into place, I will match that tariff. So there's things like that we know are known unknowns. The second item is, again, what is inevitable for Canada to retaliate. Um, the, there has been a lot of strategizing in Canada with the current federal government on what they want to do. Uh, but they were clear, I think it was about a week and a half ago, that they're not going to show their cards until they know what's on the table, for the exact reason that I just explained, the known unknown of the first one. How can you react to it if you don't know what the terms of the agreement are? And then last is for Canada, who will be the new prime minister. The Liberal Party at the helm versus the Conservative Party at the helm are going to be two very different approaches. So without knowing who the leadership in Canada is, it's going to be really challenging to know how we are going to react to it. And I know that there has been some polls lately on that topic, and it is one of the few places where the Canadian public is pretty well aligned that we probably need to go ahead and launch an election so that we have a clear understanding of kind of what the long-term paths look like for this. With a prime minister that is stepping down, it's really tough to look at a problem like this through the lens of the next 4 years. So this is kind of the end of the slide for us. I've got just a couple recent news items. So, Trump has given us kind of clear direction. I say kind of clear direction. In an offhanded conversation to a reporter, he mentioned that the tariffs will be implemented, as far as he's concerned, by February 1st. So that is like the formality of this whole conversation, is that it is an offhanded reporter comment. And then Canada was clear the next day that we are going to react with 3 steps, which is very similar to what we've been hearing in the past, which is, first, the goal is to avoid the tariffs. What can Canada do to align itself to the US's needs so that we can avoid this? And if tariffs are implemented, a reaction with counter retaliatory tariffs is the plan. And then after that is to build a long-term trade path so that we can limit the damage that's being done. So, I think one of the reasons why I was really excited that Michael wanted to join us is that I think we represent 2 bodies from the US and Canada that see this topic through a fairly similar lens. Michael, I'm going to let you speak on your side of this, but we're partners. We sit on the border with each other. We have been good neighbors, and there is just no reason to attack your neighbor. That it's not this doesn't serve either party. And I would say that it is Canada in its own way is trying to step up and figure out how to conform to the requirements, though I think personally, I'm giving my personal opinion here, so please no one quote me on this, but I think it's personally flawed that we if the border really is an issue, what we probably need to do is have some very clear metrics on how we're accomplishing a short-term goal of showing progress. Like we putting forward a 6-year plan that we're going to make significant improvements. I'm not sure that does for Trump what he's looking for. I think what he's looking for is very tangible outcomes as quickly as possible. But yeah, I think cooperation is kind of the big takeaway for me, is that this looks like 2 partners that like this has put a bit of a thorn in our relationship that I think is WDMA and Fenestration Canada. We don't agree needs to be there.
No, I agree with you, pretty much everything there. There's from our perspective, this is interrupting business and a long-standing positive trade development where we have in excess of about $600 billion a year worth of trade between our 2 countries, and putting a barrier on it, because putting a barrier on it is going to be an unnecessary challenge and really hurt the ability for everybody here to go about their, go about and building the companies and communities that they want to see. One thing that we want to we want to stress is we have a much better chance and we have a much larger voice when we are talking from the same voice, banding together. We're working on building coalitions here. I know there's things that are going on in Canada as well. I've had conversations with some members of the incoming administration about our concerns around the tariffs, and we've had conversations with the Canadian Embassy around our concerns there. And the thing that I get back is always we need to have a larger voice and be able to talk about the challenges, not only that are coming from our businesses, but how it affects the end consumer, the citizens and the people that live in these houses or renovating these houses, building new buildings and trying to tell that story and build that narrative. So, the extent to which, I will always that we can tell that story and how it's going to affect folks from getting affordable housing, which I know is a challenge on both sides of the border. This is this is a shared concern, and I think we really need to talk about that. But yeah, happy to. I don't know if you got anything else to add, Adrian.
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of put a pin at the end of that you and I and WDMA and Fenestration Canada have been having discussions in the background on putting together a joint letter that we're looking at what language would be appropriate for us both to put forward so that we are unified on this topic and that cooperation. I know from our side, we've been really appreciative that WDMA has been vocal that they want to see that. But I think there is, like you said, a lot of power in both of us showing up as a US entity and a Canadian, two associations representing our industry saying this doesn't benefit either of us, and we are opposed to this direction for these reasons. So that is in the background, is kind of the thing I can say on our side.
Yeah, I don't think that, I think we can agree that there probably couldn't be a worse time to do this. We're just starting to see a little bit of stability come back to the market. Certainly lots of challenges still, but inflation's gone down. Really, really poor timing for this to happen. So we have a few comments, a couple of questions, Adrian. I'm just going to run through. So per anonymous person here, per Google, there's a $41 billion trade deficit with Canada in 2023. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah,
so 41 is the difference of services and products. And yeah, that's exactly what that looks like.
Okay. Yeah. Inflation surged by 7.5%. Is that actual inflation predicted or the increase to what we already see?
That is the increase to what we already see based off of tariffs being implemented.
So adding to that comment, today we're around 2%. It peaked at 8 in 2022. So we're saying that if we're at 2 today, you can add 7.5 to that. We could see a 9.5% inflation. Yikes.
Yikes is right.
Yeah. Okay. Another comment, imports from Canada into the US, 13%, with oil energy being a large percentage of that. Compared with Canada, 73% of Canadian exports are to the US. Based on this, a border solution is likely the only option. Is this the likely outcome? If so, tariffs would then not be implemented and thus not impact Canada. And I think you touched on this, that the border is driving this, the challenges with the border. Is there a possibility of some sort of quick fix? I mean, a 6-year plan is not going to satisfy, the reasons behind this, I don't think.
No, and I think, at least from my point of view, and Michael, I'm curious about yours, but what I'm concerned about here is that we don't have, meaning the Trump administration has not given Canada clear guidelines on what avoiding a tariff looks like. That conversation, at least from the public view, isn't being had. So we don't have, in Canada, a clear understanding of what it would mean for us to avoid this. And so in that way, I don't, I think Trump has given us his word that he's going to implement a 25% tariff. I think we should take him at that word. I still think that puts us in a position that we need to work on the border because that is something, as I mentioned earlier, actually benefits both Canada and the US and is being asked for. And so it's not a great answer. I really wish we had clear direction from the US on what they were looking for. And I wish we had clear input from the Canadian government on what a short-term solution looks like. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, this isn't a question of moving goalposts, it's that the goalposts don't exist.
Yeah.
There's a lot of bluster and talk, but again, there's nothing on paper. It's, occasionally there will be a leak from a leak that will say, oh, this is what we'd like, but there's nothing official. And there's nothing that says, okay, this is what we want to solve this is how we want to solve this problem, and it just doesn't exist, which leads to discussions and speculations that are rife. And I don't think that's a helpful way of solving a problem that we all want to see resolved and avoided. So
Yeah.
it's roughly what they want to deal with, but I wish I knew and could tell this group exactly what they want. I'm not sure at this point they know what they want. But I think it's also part of how they're going to try and negotiate this is through a lot of ambiguity.
Yeah, crazy. Okay, how soon do you expect retaliatory tariffs to be rolled out? I know you touched on this. Days, weeks after US tariffs are applied?
Yeah, so for Canada, we can turn around within about a week if we wanted to be as aggressive as humanly possible with retaliation for the tariffs. So from call it February 1st, you could expect by February 7th or February 8th to see retaliation. That's the shortest timeline possible for the federal government. It is, I'd say, more reasonable to expect that, 2 weeks after, so you would see a retaliation.
Okay.
And then, some of the mechanics of actually getting this into play and getting the border to do what they need to do in order to apply this is also really tricky. I think there's gaps in some of that discussion.
Yeah, yeah. Tony asks, there was a presidential order on January 20th called America First Trade Policy to address unfair and unbalanced trade. This report is due April 1st, 2025. So based on this, is it realistic to see tariffs before the report is issued?
I'd say
January
yes, it
20th?
is. April 1st.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
So I would say that there's absolutely, they can institute tariffs well before then. This is an opportunity to give the incoming USTR representative and the Treasury to have their stamp on exactly what they want tariffs to look like. So that's when you'd see a slightly more developed broad strategy on trade policy and tariffs specifically come out. But and that could change what the tariff situation looks like. But they absolutely can institute tariffs before that.
Before, okay. You mentioned likely that tariffs would be enacted under the IEEPA, and you gave a timeline. He's asking about, was there a timeline for Section 232?
Yeah, so 232 takes slightly less time than a 301 does. That it's, give or take, you've got about 9 months to 12 months that you're going to see an implementation of that. Michael, at least based off of what I've been reading, I don't think it's likely to see a 232 implemented for the purposes that Trump is trying to pull off, unless there's some benefit that I've missed in a 232 versus a 301.
I mean, the benefit, I think, he could go through any of these routes. I doubt he'd do the 301 when it comes to Canada and Mexico. That I think we can probably take off the table. But 232 was what he used last time around when we went through this dog and pony show in 2017. It was 232 tariffs, not IEEPA. So there's the opportunity for both. I think obviously I think he's leaning towards IEEPA just because of what the national emergency he's declaring around energy and trade and what have you. But there's, you know, he can, the 232 is certainly not off the table for instituting these tariffs. And they look probably very similar both ways. It's whatever, you know, 232 is what Trump is familiar with, is what I'm trying to say.
So
Trump the man
just
is
a
familiar with.
thanks. A last comment from our audience. New administration that was just installed this week. We can expect more details sooner rather than later. I think we're all holding our breath and fingers are crossed. You know, hopefully we get some more clarity soon, I think is everybody's desire at this point.
Yeah. And for those that are on this call, and we've got a meeting in Surrey, our commercial glazing event that will actually be. Sorry, yeah, Terry. Sorry, I didn't mean to take your steam, but
no, it's fine, no problem. So yeah, so we're at the hour, we're past the hour, so just want to offer my thanks to Adrian. Great presentation, and Michael, thank you so much for joining us. You know, our work with WDMA is improving all the time. Really happy to have you working with us and looking at these challenges that we're all faced with. Couple of things that are coming up in the near future for people. February 19th, Tech Talk. We're doing a session on door component suppliers, kind of a mini 1-hour trade show, if you like. So if you're a door component, hinge door component supplier, check out the item on our website that went out today or yesterday, and you can reach out to me and get in on that one. And then Adrian just talked about on April the 8th, our second inaugural or our second annual Canadian Glazing Conference is being held in Surrey, April the 8th. You can contact Lane to exhibit or contact me about educational presentation sessions. Adrian is going to be doing another tariff session, and by April the 8th, we're hoping to have a whole lot more information. And we're hoping, Michael, that you're going to be able to join us there. Looking forward to that. So yeah, with that, just want to thank our sponsor, OpenJanela. Thanks to you guys. Thanks for everybody participating. Great session today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much.